On behalf of our partners at Neiman, my colleague Anne-Marie Lipinski, I want to welcome you all to this conference. Anne-Marie and I were young reporters together at the Chicago Tribune, and she remembers that I started this career way back in the Pleistocene era as a political reporter. And in that role, I had a chance to cover a couple of national campaigns. And as we were preparing for this event, I got to thinking just how much harder your job is than mine was then. We did not have 24/7 cable coverage. We did not have social media to monitor and interpret. We had this thing, I see John Ralston here, he'll remember this, we had this thing called news cycles, where you actually had time to consider what you were writing, report it thoroughly, and publish it when it was ready. We didn't have the pressures of having to file constantly in order to keep up with the day's news. So we were playing checkers. You guys are playing three-dimensional chess now. And I'm very excited for all of you to cover this campaign. Our goal here is to try and arm you with some of the things that you'll need to be as smart as you can be in dealing with the deluge of information and events that you'll have to deal with as part of your duties in covering this campaign. I want to thank not just Neiman, who've been great partners. This is the second time we've done this conference, but also our supporters from the McCormick Foundation, the Joyce Foundation, and from Google, and obviously thanks to them for hosting us in this great space today. So we're looking forward to a wonderful conference. I know I'm going to learn things. I hope you guys do as well, and I hope I get a chance to meet as many of you as I can in the next 24 hours. And with that, let me turn it over to Anne-Marie Lipinski to introduce our first panel.
Thank you, David. I just want to say how great it is to be working with you again, you and your colleagues. As I reminded David on the first day of my summer internship at the Chicago Tribune, the very first person to come over and talk to me was this guy. He introduced himself. He was a young reporter, but he was an established reporter, and I was a nobody. And so the moral of the story is always be nice to the interns.
I left as a nobody, and you became editor of the newspaper, so.
Yeah, David Axelrod, a nobody. But one thing I wanted to say just before we get started is one of the things I love about this gathering, and that was true in 2016 when we did it, is that we have such a range of experience in the room, from people who've been doing this for a long time to people who will be on their first embed, from people who are covering this at the national level to people who will never be on a campaign plane, but who will be trying to make sense of this in their local communities. And so we'll have a lot of smart people on stage for you to hear from throughout the 2 days. But the knowledge that's in this room, I hope you all take advantage of. You have a lot to learn during breaks from each other. So with that, I just wanted to turn this over to our first panel. One of the first people I reached out to when we started working on this was Margaret, because she had started writing. Obviously, you all know she's Margaret Sullivan is a media critic for the Washington Post. And she'd started writing early in the year about sort of entreating the industry to do better and to do different this time out. And so I called her and I said, I'd really like to talk about that and how you're thinking about it. And she thinks about it not just as a media critic, but as somebody who ran a newspaper, right? She was the longtime editor of the Buffalo News. So she's not just finger wagging, she's speaking from experience. So we said, let's start us off with kind of challenging us to think better and to think differently about our work. So with that, please join us in welcoming Margaret in the first panel.
Well, good morning, and welcome to what sounds like a great conference. I have an all-star panel here, and I'm going to tell you who they are. So just to my right is Jamelle Bouie. He is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times and formerly political correspondent for Slate. Next to him is Peter Hamby, who is the head of news at Snapchat and was at CNN covering politics for about 10 years before that. Eliana Johnson covers the White House for Politico. And Jonathan Martin is a national political correspondent for the New York Times. So a lot of experience and a lot of smarts up here. So I will start out by saying that on election night of 2016, I threw out the column that I thought I was going to write as stories were being thrown out around the nation, and quickly wrote a column that referred to the coverage of the campaign overall, perhaps hyperbolically, as an epic fail. But I was in a hurry, so I couldn't use the whole word failure. Anyway, looking back, I think we, as a media writ large, got a lot of things wrong and did get some things right. So, but I think we can do better this time. One of the things I hear from people all the time is, horse race coverage is bad. You need to do better with substance and policy. And I want to start off with Peter, who wrote a great piece that I commend to everyone that was in Vanity Fair in January. In fact, we could just suspend the conference, just go read his piece, and we'll be done. But he makes it's very long, but it's also very, very good. And he makes the good point that that's a sort of a false dichotomy. So, Peter, talk to us a little bit about that, about the idea of it's not sexy versus boring, horse race versus policy, that there can be there's a more nuanced way of thinking about that.
Yeah, thank you for the plug. For decades, I think that a lot of campaign coverage has been defined by, horse race coverage, polls, gaffes, personalities, conflicts, and there's always been this timeless debate about there's not enough policy being covered, there's not enough substance being covered, and it's sort of ebbed and flowed over the years, but I think it's kind of an enduring truth that most political coverage is sort of, fluff and personality based, and it's certainly, I think, in 2012, felt that way. I think that, Politico and sort of, BuzzFeed and the sort of like tip sheet style political coverage led to this kind of like, tidbit journalism where the scooplet was everything, right? Like this campaign fired their Latino focus group guy, and like there's an internal poll I'm hearing about, and all of these things were really rewarded in Washington journalism, and that, like, I covered that. All of us, I think some of us at least on stage, really thought those things were the coin of the realm. And I think, unfortunately, we went into 2016 thinking that's how politics should be covered. But I think that Trump in the White House has kind of been a forcing mechanism for most reporters, whether they're inclined to cover more sort of like campaign horse race journalism or policy journalism, to cover policy and to cover substance. I mean, Trump's scandals are policy in a lot of ways. Even during the campaign, Hillary was getting covered for emails. Those were her scandals. Trump's scandals were policy. Build the wall, ban Muslims. And since taking over in the White House, his audacity around a lot of things has forced reporters to not only cover policy, but think about new ways to do it. If you think back to the heyday of policy journalism, I think it was kind of the wonky Vox era, like 2009, 2010, when, these, upstart bloggers and websites were covering healthcare and the bailouts and stimulus through the prism of like data viz and graphics. I think what Trump has done, and I'm thinking of the border separations as a good example, is he's forced journalists in television, in print, digital, whatever, to really kind of put a face and a human narratives to a lot of his stories. And because the stakes feel so high with Trump, readers and consumers and audiences care, and we are serving them, I think, with more policy journalism than ever. So I do think the kind of like campaign-style journalism, policy-style journalism is kind of a false choice now. I don't necessarily think the horse race stuff is going to get better. I mean, That's the debate that you're talking about that was happening a few months ago. Like, how do we save 2020 from more, gaffe-style journalism? That's not going to go away, but I do think we're seeing more good policy journalism than ever.
Okay. And one question I have particularly for Jonathan and Eliana is, people will often say to me, like I should know the answer to this question. Have the media learned anything since 2016? And I'm really not sure how much internal soul searching or let's do it better there has been within news organizations like the Times and Politico. I mean, is it kind of like, okay, we're going to go do it again, or is there a sense of wanting to do it differently and better?
Oh, I think emphatically so.
Yeah.
I think, it's not like there's a convening of a 3-day retreat to sort of figure out exactly like how to don the hair shirt and figure out the way forward. But it is a recurring conversation. And to me, the answer is just to be open-minded about the eventualities of this campaign and to not make prejudgments about who can or can't win or can't be the nominee of
the narrative
either party, and just be open to the campaign. And in some ways, that's more fun anyways for us, right? I mean, I think one of the best parts of the gig is the uncertainty of campaigns, the surprises. It makes deadlines a little bit hairy at times, but that's kind of what makes it so intriguing is you don't know what's going to happen. And so that is a better thing to cover than a coronation anyways for us. So I think this Democratic primary especially is characterized entirely by uncertainty and sort of any assumption you have, if it wasn't discarded on January 1st, it sure as hell should be now, given that in the first quarter of this year, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, outraised 5 sitting U.S. senators.
Pretty hard to predict.
Who would have guessed that in January, right? So, but that's a good lesson for us, though, because that just reinforces one of my favorite quotes, which is, the future outwits all of our certitudes. Schlesinger. And I come back to that time and time again because you just don't know what's going to happen. And politics is now so uncertain, and all the verities are out the window now. And I think that makes our job more challenging, but I think it also makes it more fun.
Yeah. Eliana, please take that up and also, talk a little bit about the Trump factor in all of this. I mean, we seem very concentrated right now on the Democratic field, but Trump is, so dominant, and how do we deal with that?
So in answer to the first question, I think the answer is yes and no. And Jonathan hit on the yes part, that you'll constantly hear reporters now say, well, Trump certainly smashed our certitudes, and in the coverage of the Democratic field, particularly on cable news panels, you'll hear all the time reporters say, Trump showed us that we simply don't know what a viable presidential candidate looks like. He shattered the notions of viability. But I think, certainly in my conversations with reporters and others, what I think we maybe didn't take away from 2016 is I think there's still a general sort of sneering disdain among reporters for Trump, and I think Trump voters generally, that hasn't gone away. And it's sort of small things like, there's a lot of focus on a continuing focus on Trump's lies, which I think is important, but less focus on, when you hear focus groups of Trump voters, like his voters do understand that he lies all the time. I mean, it's not that, they're not complete morons. And so I don't see like that much curiosity among reporters about, okay, then why are they supporting this person who they know is an inveterate liar? So I think small things like that, it's not simply the media's job to be arbiters of truth and point out, when the president lies and when he's telling the truth, but also to tell people, why voters back somebody like this nonetheless. So I think 2016 did show us that, it is our job to try to understand the political forces in the country. I don't think we did a good job of that. And I do think that we'll do better in 2020. I think the open question is how much better. And I think something that Peter said grabbed me. I do agree that Trump has forced a focus on policy, but it's very different from the sort of heyday of the Vox policy reporting, in that I think Trump has showed how to do it, which is that you need some sexiness and personality-driven reporting to be able to show people why policy can be interesting. And that's sort of the great gift I think Trump has given to policy reporters. And I'll tell my colleagues all the time, like, you can get anyone to read a policy story, but there has to be something to draw people in. Mm-hmm. And that's what Trump does. I think he's made people realize why policy is important. And with his sort of enormous personality, he has really done that.
Yeah.
Because the Vox policy breakdowns are not appealing to a mass audience, but the child separation policy, with particularly in the way Trump talks about it, does draw eyeballs.
Right. Great observations. So, Jamelle, you've made the transition from sort of the news side of things to the opinion side of things. How does opinion journalism fit into doing it better?
I think, well, at Slate, I was doing quite a bit of opinion stuff. I think the nature of the opinion stuff I'm doing is a little different, and I think the way in which it's different, and for people in roles like mine, is that we can think very broadly and big picture about what Eliana called the larger forces driving American politics. I think one of the ways it's important for us to get it better is to not. I've been trying to figure out a way to say this that is sort of like neutral, and I can't, so I'll just say
say it in the
easy,
provocative way.
Is that what I think was a major failure of opinion journalists in 2016 was basically presupposing the basic goodness of a set of voters, that presupposing that they are voting for sort of reasons that are understandable and reasons that are, whatever you think of them, are legitimate reasons to cast a vote, to act politically.
Like economic anxiety
right.
versus racism,
right.
Let's say.
And I think, and I think that's true for some set of voters, but the extent to which it was presupposed that it was true, and that there was a real sort of dismissal of attempts to explain the choices of some voters in terms of more base desires, I think really hampered an ability to understand what was happening. And so, looking forward to 2020, right? I don't think you can understand President Trump's campaign strategy if you don't understand that he himself recognizes his sort of racial demagoguery as a asset politically among his voters, and taking that seriously, and taking seriously what it means about the voters themselves, not in any more, not as a moral judgment, but in simply looking clear-eyed at what voters' choices are revealing about what they want and how they view the country, is going to be really critical. Otherwise, I think we will find ourselves in a situation where, if the president is reelected, we're suddenly shocked that he's taken actions like child separation, despite the fact that in 2016, he clearly telegraphed that kind of behavior throughout.
Mm-hmm. But we kind of chose not to believe it or didn't want to believe it.
Right. It was just appealing to the base. It was just sort of hyperbolic language. Certainly, he's not going to. He may not govern as sort of a racial demagogue, and I think that has clearly been shown not to be the case.
Peter, you look like you wanted to say something about that. No.
No, I just I'm just thinking through what they were both saying, that like one of the most important things about this coming campaign and looking back on 16 is just challenging assumptions.
Yeah.
Like assuming that we know what voters' motivations are, what candidates' motivations are. Harvard does a post-campaign conference every 4 years where all the campaign managers get together and sort of rehash what happened through the primaries and whatnot.
Sometimes they yell at each other.
This time they yelled at each other a
Yes.
lot. It was very raw.
Yeah.
And I remember Terry Sullivan, who was Marco Rubio's campaign manager, you guys know, we were talking about the moment Trump said ban Muslims. And if you think back to the way we covered that in the press at the time, we're just like, oh my God, I can't believe he would say such a thing. He's going to lose the Republican primary. He's going to lose the election. And Terry, who came up in South Carolina politics, is deeply familiar with the South Carolina Republican base, which isn't, all racist, but certainly has, a history of sort of, racial anxiety throughout it. He was like, oh, he's going to win the primary. He just knew. And it's just like, we have to spend more time listening to people and not necessarily listening to Twitter, because there were a lot of signals out there that Trump was doing very well. And there were a lot of signals, too, that Hillary Clinton lacked the kind of enthusiasm in certain communities that Barack Obama had. And at the end of the day, weirdly enough, as much as we call Trump an aberration and think it's weird that he won, he actually did kind of uphold like a pretty sturdy rule of politics, which is that...
I totally agree with this.
Yeah, like that Hillary Clinton was a quasi-incumbent coming off a 2-term president. Voters want change. He had a very simple message that moved people, like it or not, and Hillary didn't, right? And
I totally
traditionally,
agree
that's
with this.
what happens in politics. The other guy wins.
I agree with that in the sense that one of the things that I think you talked, Peter, about the media's focus on these sort of micro incremental scoops, and a lot of that was about ground game and the mechanics of campaigns, and Trump didn't have any of that. And Hillary wasn't in Wisconsin and all this stuff. And some of that might have been true and amounted for a couple of points here or there. But the election, I think, basically was about candidate quality. Like, people didn't like really either of these candidates. But Trump was a better candidate in that he was... he had a simple, clear message. And one of the things I've heard conservatives and Republicans say over and over again is that the other Republican candidates walked on eggshells around these things like, racial preferences, immigration, the Muslim ban. And Trump had no fear about what the media response would be to his saying the unsayable, what other Republicans felt was the unsayable. He didn't care about the Democratic response, but other Republicans would have never said the sorts of things Trump said. And in fact, the voters welcomed it. And I think he really showed that, in fact, it wasn't just the news media that got the Republican voters wrong. It was the Republican Party leadership, which had backed comprehensive immigration reform and free trade. I think Trump really exposed that the coastal elites, which was, think tank members, university professors, Republican donors, and Peter Thiel was somebody who glommed onto this. I know he said at some point in a private conversation with Paul Ryan, so why is Donald Trump, why is Donald Trump president and you're not? Yeah. Given that their positions were polar opposite. But I think, there was a really fascinating study done by NYU where it was in the drama school, actually. Excuse me for going off on a tangent, but they had actors reenact the presidential debates almost exactly, except for that they had a woman play Trump and a man play Clinton. And they did these plays before an audience, and they had people poll the likability of each candidate. And in fact, Hillary, played by a man, was less likable. And Trump, played by a woman, was even more likable. And they got the audience reaction, and I remember there was one drama teacher in the audience who was quoted saying that Trump's message was like lyrics in a play, and people could just attach to them very easily. And so people began to understand, I think, through these dramatic performances, why Trump had won. And it was very simple. It came down to messaging.
I'm not David Broder. I've only this will be my fourth campaign or whatever. But 2016 made me feel like the media consensus was more removed than ever from normal people, whatever that means. I'm not just talking about Trump voters. I'm talking about Democrats, moderates, suburbanites, whatever. I remember being at the debate. What was the town hall debate where Trump was sort of moving around the stage and sort of
He was lurking.
Lurking.
Yes.
It's at Washington University in St. Louis, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I remember looking at Twitter, and I was in the press file, and everyone was like, "Oh my God, Trump's nuts! This is crazy. He's going to lose." I was getting like text messages from not just sources, but just kind of like regular people who were just like, Trump's winning.
Yeah.
Or I like this. And like, it was just such an interesting disconnect between elite opinion and not. And like, I keep going back to the fact, like 2012, I think about a lot. I think that we didn't heed a lot of lessons from that campaign. One of them was, and this is partly because of the Obama campaign using data so much, like the press then bent into like
Data's
a
everything.
fealty toward data, the numbers are everything, and it became all science and no art.
Yeah.
And even in the press too, we used to like scoff at the old kind of like shoe leather,
Lawn
door
signs,
knocking,
yeah.
reporting, that kind of old school stuff. Like we have data now, like we have so many elite voices who are so smart, and we lost sight of some very fundamental old school habits of good journalism and good political journalism, which is just sort of just listening.
Yeah.
Well, we've tried to fix that by going to every diner in America now, which
Yeah,
is not,
but-
I don't think that's necessarily the answer,
It's,
but
yeah, overcompensating. But the lesson that I took from 2016 is that there's a false choice between talking to real people and relying on the polls. You got to do both, and that's the best way to, I think, fix the problems that ail us. Is more reporting is the answer. And we shouldn't throw out polls. Polls are invaluable, but you shouldn't rely on polls entirely. When I think back to 2016 and I think back to conversations I had with voters, it really it sticks with me because I saw it. And I could smell it from talking to voters in places like Raleigh, North Carolina one day. And I think like back to a small community between Athens and Columbus, Ohio, on a different day where I talked to voters, and the antipathy towards the Clintons was so evident among Democrats too. These are Obama voters, and so I think that marrying those two, I think is important. If I could say anything to some of the embeds who are here today, or the kind of younger reporters, it would be this: some of the most important stories that you do, and memorable and lasting stories you do, will piss people off. Do not be afraid to write something that your sources or the campaign you're covering is not going to like.
And other reporters.
Yes.
And very smart people and your bosses. Like, you are out there in the field, you're on the ground, you are the leading indicators of opinion.
Your fidelity is to the story and to the truth. And if you get yelled at on Twitter, so be it, because you're gonna have to at times to write the stories that you have to write. There's a lot of pieces I wish I could take back from the last campaign. One of the ones that I'm most proud of that I did, that I caught holy hell over, was on Labor Day of 2016. I had somebody leak to me, a focus group, that a constellation of liberal groups had done with younger, largely African-American male voters, I think 3 American cities. And the results were striking. They thought that Hillary and Trump were one and the same. They had no appetite for Hillary at all, and they thought the whole system was rotten, and they weren't going to show up to vote. And the person who leaked it to me was desperately afraid of that happening and wanted to sort of like put a flare up. And I wrote it, and the Clinton folks went crazy, and there was so much anger about it. And it was an important story to do, and obviously that was one of her key challenges on Election Day. Did I enjoy getting yelled at or having the campaign folks call and bitch? Of course not. But that's the nature of what we do. And if you're not willing to do that, go into PR.
great, good advice. I should have mentioned at the top that we'll go to audience questions, and we're going to do that in 18 minutes. But so think about what you might want to ask these folks. And I'd like to get into something that's on my mind, which is the coverage of the women in the Democratic field. There's some new research from Northeastern University that got a little bit of attention this past week that said that so far the coverage of the women candidates has been more negative than of the male candidates. I can't cite it chapter and verse, but that was the big takeaway. And, you know, it does seem, and I've written a column about this, that, you know, sort of immediately the attention was going to Biden, who hasn't declared, and Bernie Sanders and Beto O'Rourke, and that the qualified and, you know, interesting women candidates were sort of like cast off to the side. So I'd just like to throw this open to the group. Do we have any obligation to think about that and to compensate for it, or to, I don't know, do something about it. I'll just mention one other thing, which is that a great New York Times piece by Maggie Astor, pointed out the kind of the catch-22 of being a woman candidate, which is that you have to be likable. It's extremely important. A male candidate doesn't have to be likable. A woman candidate must be likable. And one of the things that makes women unlikable is ambition. So probably if you're running for president, you're ambitious, and therefore you're not likable. It's just this kind of weird catch-22. So what's the role of the press in dealing with these gender issues that are coming up in this diverse field? I'll just throw this out to the group.
Should I jump in as the white dude?
Go ahead.
No, I'm like trying very hard to like check my biases around this stuff and talking to many different reporters about it and people in politics. I think the most interesting test case at the moment might be Buttigieg, because immensely like interesting guy who, speaking of just talking to people, and I live in Los Angeles now, like away from DC.
The base.
And I do hear people mention him a lot organically. But someone was like, could a 37-year-old female mayor without a real strong policy, architecture, and background run for president? I think the answer, like, would that person be getting the same amount of attention? I think the answer is no. I just think it's really important for the kind of like reporters like myself, like men in particular, to sort of think twice about before they make a statement or think about how they write about women candidates. I will say, like I was at Kamala Harris's announcement event in Oakland. I mean, Kamala and Elizabeth Warren are getting lots of coverage, a lot of coverage. Mm-hmm. Gillibrand and Amy Klobuchar are not. But you can make the counter argument that like maybe they haven't articulated a compelling message to run for president in a way that Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren have. Like, so look, I think that Bernie and Biden are certainly getting a large amount of coverage out of the gate because they're both immensely famous people. Joe Biden was a 2-term vice president. Like, he's run for president twice before. He's been in politics for almost 50 years. Yeah, he's getting a lot of coverage. Bernie Sanders ran last time. He's getting a lot of coverage. It gets murkier when you get to the other tiers of the campaign.
Okay. Anybody else on that?
Yeah, I don't agree that women have to be likable and men don't have to be likable. Or often you hear that women have to be attractive and men don't have to be attractive. I think there are a lot of men who have taken flack for not being likable. I think candidates simply have to be likable. Last time we had an election where both candidates were unlikable. It was a fluke election. But Ted Cruz took so much flack for being unlikable. Al Gore took lots of flack for not having charisma and being unlikable. So did Kerry. It's a thing in politics that it is an advantage to have charisma and to be warm and likable. And I think it's an expectation and an advantage with both voters for both women and men. Similarly, I think being conventionally attractive is an advantage among both women and men. I remember a famous television personality telling me last time, joking about Rand Paul running for president and saying he's not going to be president of the United States. He's 5'5" and has funny hair. And there's something to that. I think that people have reactions they can't control about their expectations of physical appearance that apply to both men and women. I think we've never had a president in the television era who's below 5'10". Correct me, somebody, if I'm wrong. But I think there are reasons for that people are reluctant to talk about because it's not fair. And I think that this applies, I do think it applies somewhat equally, unfortunately,
But what is our role? What is our role in dealing with that? Just let it be?
I think our role is to talk about it. I think the news media is reluctant to talk about it because it is not fair.
I think it goes back to what we were saying, which is that a lot of elite opinion is formed on Twitter. Twitter is a platform that rewards righteousness and stridency and loud opinions. It's valuable in other ways. But the narratives on Twitter are sometimes different from the narratives you hear from folks who aren't on Twitter. And it's our duty just to sort of listen to voters, right? Like, the question is Elizabeth Warren like in the middle of the pack in polls because she's not getting media coverage? Or is it because voters aren't saying they like her in polls, right? And I understand that those two things are intertwined, but we have to listen to what voters of all races, all genders, all ages are saying, unpack that, match it against the polls, match it against what the media is saying. But like, it's not the media's fault all the way that certain candidates aren't getting attention. It certainly fuels
This
part of
isn't
it.
about the research, though. It wasn't about whether they were getting attention. It was about whether they were getting negative attention. They were
Right.
being covered.
Right, and sort of on that point, I mean, I think Mayor Pete is very instructive here because, in my view, a lot of the coverage has a lot of embedded assumptions about sort of someone, and I think this is true for Biden to a certain extent as well. That is, coverage assumes that people like Biden or Mayor Pete would be appealing to a certain group of voters, and based off that assumption, goes ahead and sort of that drives how they're covered. Similarly, there's an assumption that candidates like Elizabeth Warren may not be appealing, and usually all this is around sort of blue-collar white men or blue-collar white women, that candidates like Warren or Harris may not be appealing to them. And I think it's important for journalists of all stripes, but especially opinion journalists who are often in the business of making kind of these pronouncements, to really interrogate whatever embedded assumptions we may have about those candidates. For my part, I don't know, right, if not even a young mayor, but a young mayor of a liberal place that went heavily for Hillary Clinton, one of those tiny blue islands in red states, is necessarily going to appeal to anyone. And I wonder if part of the reason he seemed so dynamic is just an assumption that this young white guy from Indiana must be appealing to moderate voters. Is that actually the case? Is it actually the case that, yes, a former vice president, but a politician who has had had very little success running nationally, is it the case that he will necessarily be broadly appealing? And while polls can tell us something, we're also bringing assumptions to how we understand those polls and how we understand these narratives.
You could also make the argument that Mayor Pete has been carried to this point in the polls by an abundance of media coverage. And if you think about the most analogous figure in politics who's a female, it's AOC, right? Someone who's young and represents a tiny slice of blue. But like, she created her own reality, right? Like, she created her own following on the internet by, not just before her winning that primary, but since then. And the media has sort of come back to covering her. Like, she's found her own ways of getting attention. But since then, she has, been rewarded for that by the media. So there are, I think, some counterexamples.
Yeah.
I just want to echo what Jamelle said about checking our assumptions, because recent history has proven that everything that we assume going into elections, the opposite was true in both parties. Democrats were so determined after Bush won in 2000, and then obviously after 9/11 and the Iraq War. We can't be outflagged. We have to get a veteran. We have to get someone that can wave the stars and the stripes that's got Purple Hearts. That's the way to beat the Chicken Hawks, right? John Kerry is the nominee for really pragmatic purposes. He loses. Oh my gosh, we've lost Red America. We've got to figure out how to appeal between the two coasts. Y'all remember that map about Jesus Land was the sort of red swath of America?
What's the matter with that?
Yeah, in 2004, let's find Phil Bredesen or Mark Warner or some kind of red state Democrat. That's the key to win in 2008. Actually, it was an African American from one of the biggest cities in the country named Barack Hussein Obama that was the answer. Oh, okay. Flash forward to Mitt Romney losing in 2012. Oh my gosh, we've lost the rising electorate. Hispanics are all voting for Democrats. We've got to reform the party and create compassionate conservatism too. Let's get Marco Rubio or somebody that reflects this new America. No, actually, you're going to get a 72-year-old real estate developer who's running on racial grievance. And that's going to capture the presidency. The point that I'm making is all of these assumptions that were baked in years going into these elections were flipped. And things that we thought were unimaginable actually turned out to be the case. So Yes, don't assume that Joe Biden is the obvious answer for Democrats to take back Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Who the heck knows what the answer is going to be? And we shouldn't make the assumption that he would necessarily be the obvious solution. And if you aren't sure about that, just look back at the last 20 years.
Good. That's a great point. So before we go to questions, I just want to do a kind of a lightning round where I ask each of you to tell me one thing that you hope at the end of the 2020 election you can look back and say, I and we did much better. What would that one thing be? So maybe we'll just go down the aisle here if I can put you on the spot.
Sure, yeah.
Sorry, no warning on that.
So earlier in the conversation, we talked a little bit about polls and sort of being sure to balance polls and metrics and such with reporting. But I think there's an opposite point to make, which is that we should take what modeling and metrics says very seriously. I think in 2016, the thing that happened is that the modeling of that election said it was going to be a very close election that either candidate could win. And we saw Donald Trump, or many reporters saw Donald Trump and said, well, I know intellectually that this is anyone's game, but come on, he's not going to win.
Right.
I hope after 2020, we learn that although there are limitations to that kind of data, it's also important to sort of not dismiss what it's suggesting.
Right.
If the collected data of the metrics suggests that Donald Trump has, let's say, like a third chance of winning re-election, and suggests he had a third chance of winning an election, that's a serious chance. If someone came to me right now and said, Jamelle, if you go to a random audience member, punch them, and there's a third chance we'll get $1 million, I don't know if I wouldn't do it, right? I couldn't tell you that I wouldn't do it.
Right. We don't understand probability well at all, and that was a huge problem. Yeah. So that's a great answer. Peter?
Maybe this is because I work at Snapchat and I am immersed in...
Big with the kids.
It's
the new blogs.
Yeah, you were a blogger.
I was a blogger,
blogger?
It was huge back in the day. Look it up, blogs, they were big, they're huge.
I'm immersed in this world of people under the age of 25. They don't watch cable news, they don't read newspapers, certainly, and these are all broad generalizations, but mostly true. They are spending an immense amount of time on their phones, and we all are as a country. The political news media is unfortunately obsessed with itself. We all read the same things. We all watch the same things. And I think that's part of the reason I think that we didn't pay attention to Trump's durability. I think that, and Bernie the same way, I think that it is important for every reporter covering this campaign, and it is going to be a strength of the sort of younger reporters and the embeds in the audience, because you guys intuitively understand new technologies and new platforms, to spend time in new spaces, watch and read things that your bosses are not reading. I think that will give you clues, it will make you smarter, and it will help you create content and news to meet consumers where they actually are, instead of like where we all think they should be. There are podcasts that are doing this very smartly. Selfishly, I think we're doing that at Snap. I think there are other reporters who are very creative about using new platforms to reach audiences. A tiny, less than 1%, a fractional amount of people in this country are watching cable news. Mm-hmm. When I worked at CNN, I always said that, but I was also really proud of the fact that I got to write for CNN.com, which reached huge amounts of people. But at the time, my bosses were sort of like dismissive of CNN.com, right? But now it's like, you're going to hit more people there than you will on television. So just as much as we're checking our assumptions on what polls say and what voters think and whatever, check your assumptions about what people watch. Always pay attention to the normals, what they're doing when they're on the subway, when they're in the car, when they're at the park, when they're picking up their kids at school, when they're in Starbucks. What are they looking at on their phones? What shows are they watching? Figure out ways to meet them where they are, and also to sort of like read what they're reading. Just ask normal people what they're reading and where they're getting their news. That's really, really, really important for TV.
Okay, good. Let's go fast, though. Eliana?
Forget what the question was now.
What would you like, at the end of the campaign, what would you like to say things went better with? What would you like to see having changed?
Yeah, I think that simply that the news media better reflected where the voters were, and gave a better understanding of what was happening in the country.
Good. John?
I would just say very quickly, get out, leave wherever the city you are, talk to voters, and sort of try to get at what they're actually thinking, and then pair that with the extensive research data that there is, and kind of use that as your guiding force. Don't rely on real Americans in diners, and don't rely on the polls. Do all of the above, and talk to people in cities, in suburbs, in small towns. I mean, just don't limit yourself to any demographic, and be open to be surprised and be challenged, and use everything at your disposal to figure out what the story actually is.
Great. Okay, so let's go to questions. There is a stationary mic there. So somebody start, please, because you know how it goes with questions. Somebody has to start.
I guess I'll go ahead and start.
Good.
I'll start with an easy question. So AP Style recently said it's okay to call things racist. And I wanted to know, obviously an easy question, what does that look like for 2020 coverage, both editorially and structurally? So what does that look like when you're covering the campaign, and also what does that look like when it comes to hiring?
Anyone?
I'm happy to jump in.
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing, and we should be open about saying things are racist when they are. Look, I think that the kind of euphemism of like racially charged or like racially fueled, if it's a euphemism and you're using it to like not say racist, then that's silly. Just say racist. But I think there are moments though where things are more ambiguous, and like it's okay to say racially tinged. Yeah, if that's what it is, right? If it's not totally clear and it's more a sort of uncertain territory, then you can use that phrase. If it's racist, then call it racist. To me, it's just not a complicated.
It's sort of the thing that comes up around liar, too.
I was
Sure, call
say
it.
that.
Say lie.
I mean, it assumes there's an intentionality there, but if you can figure that out, I think then that's okay.
I mean, I think sort of part of the challenge of this is that there's no common agreement really about what that actually means to call something racist. Now, when I use the term, right, I actually am very indifferent to like the internal state of the person in question. I can't read anyone's heart, but I can put their words in a larger cultural context, in a larger political context, and say that this kind of language or this is evoking ideas and narratives that are that themselves racist. And so whether or not even the person realizes it, that's what's happening. And that I think that's a complicated thing to make a case for doing. And I think going forward in 2020, we'll see a lot of we'll see a lot of work and challenges trying to figure out what exactly do we mean by saying racist, and is it going to be kind of a broad usage, or is it going to be a very narrow? Oh well, this person, I saw a glimpse of their chest, and there's like a swastika, so I can say that they are a racist.
Great. Next.
My question's about crowded fields. So the 2016 presidential Republican primary was very crowded. The Chicago's mayor's race was very, very crowded. I just finished covering that. And the Democratic side of the primary is also very crowded. What advice or tips do you have for reporters and newsrooms to cover the crowded field without dubbing candidates as frontrunners, and how to use resources wisely so that you're not falling down on covering a candidate who actually ends up becoming the front runner?
Tough question.
It is.
Ready?
I mean, I think that you kind of answered your question a little bit, which is that no matter what these polls say, this is the Democratic field, at least, is historically like there is not a precedent for what's happening right now. There just isn't on the Democratic side, and no one should be treated as a front runner. Like, I think that a lot of people can gain oxygen, and you should assign reporters to cover them and spend an immense amount of time with them. Like, I think that you just have to kind of be out there in the field listening to how voters are responding to them. That's not a very easy answer at all. But
Short of like a quota of like, we're gonna do 14 profiles. Do you have any like ideas or tips for how to do smart coverage of all candidates that put them all on an even playing
The,
field?
the debates will help, I think. I mean, because the debates will offer access to all the candidates over 2 days. But and I think that combined with all these cattle calls that are already happening, where you see 10, 12 candidates in a day on the same stage, and you can gauge the response both in real time to the candidates and also just talking to voters afterwards about, or talking to attendees afterwards about their reaction, I think will help guide you to that. Just like let the voters kind of tell you what they think, and I think if you just sort of,
Stay close.
give them the wheel, right? Jesus, take the wheel. It's like the voters take the wheel, and I think that will help you. I think a great deal. And in Chicago, like Lightfoot was obviously getting a lot of attention and like interest from voters here, and that was not necessarily reflected in the polls because they were so split here in Chicago. But like, she was a name that you would hear that was coming up from among voters of interest, and I think that's the clue. If you hear that name kind of recurring, that's the giveaway.
Thanks.
Hi. Yes, my first, a quick sort of frustration. I'm a yes, and because yes, and that I'm actually from South Carolina. And there are sort of like black voters in red states. Had we listened to them, at least before 2016, then of course that we absolutely would have known that Trump was possible. That's one thing. I'm a yes. I'm a yes. And then I'm sort of actually having said that. Are we sort of overthinking? Sort of like 2016. Especially with the fact that Trump sort of actually lost the popular vote by 3 million. And also, even though that he actually got sort of like last minute help, at least actually from the FBI director himself, from sort of like WikiLeaks, and also at least from us overall, given the fact that we spent I guess sort of that gobs of time on sort of that Hillary's email versus all of his scandals combined.
So, okay, thank you. A lot there. So just reframing it a little bit, what was the press's role in putting too much emphasis on Hillary Clinton's emails and how that might be interpreted in this coming cycle? So, Jonathan, I'm going to ask you to handle that. I know
I'm shocked.
I know it might not be fair, but
Yeah, look, I think it's important to have balance about the candidates and their biographies and their attributes and their transgressions, and I think you have to sort of weigh that with the sort of relative scale of who they are and what they did. What does bother me a little bit is when I hear the butt her emails complaint, which I think is totally fair, it's often followed by, and Trump got away scot-free, there was no coverage.
that is not true.
Emphatically
No,
not
right.
true. Voters had their eyes wide open about Trump. I mean, the media did extensive coverage. The Post and the Times especially wrote extensively about his conduct on race, as a real estate developer, his finances, extensively. I remember in August of 2016, there was a few Sundays in a row where we had lengthy stories about him.
The Washington Post actually did a book about Trump.
Right. His sexual misconduct, we wrote extensively about that. And dozens of women came forward. It was out there, and if voters chose not to I think respond to that, then that's their choice. But they had the information because we did a lot of reporting. Mm-hmm. It's fair to say that you guys were sort of trying to balance the two candidates by using the emails to sort of elevate her with him, that's a fair critique. But it's not fair to say that there was no scrutiny of Trump.
Right.
There was a lot.
Okay, good.
Hi. So there's a growing, fewer and fewer people, as you mentioned, are watching cable news and reading newspapers, but it's also true that fewer and fewer people are trusting these sources. We're all familiar with the term fake news, and there's growing antipathy towards the mainstream media and journalism in general, especially given the fact that journalists are guaranteed to be wrong or misrepresent things occasionally just by nature of journalism. How do we maintain our credibility among the populace in which it's wavering, and how do we regain credibility among those who no longer rely on journalists for truth?
Well, yeah, so somebody take that, because it's like the question of all time.
I looked this up yesterday because I'm preoccupied with this question too. You can parse questions about trust in media a lot of different ways, and you learn a lot from different polls. But Gallup has been tracking, again, a generic question, U.S. trust in mass media since 1973. The most precipitous drop of that number was during and after the Iraq War, which encompassed both, a rush to war on the part of the press, the famous Dan Rather scandal from 60 Minutes. And the second biggest was during 2015 and 2016 was Trump was running. And it dropped to 35%, its lowest ever. And you could attribute that a lot to Trump really banging at home with Republicans. At the same time, there's plenty of Democrats and independents who lost trust in media too, because they don't think they're covering what's relevant. Go look at any number of polls. Pew has done good stuff on this. I think the political press covers too much political intrigue and skills. The complaint you hear from people about this stuff is that they're not covering issues. They're not covering healthcare. They're not covering wars. They're not covering immigration. That's what you heard around 2016 and 2017. The good news is that number for trust in media has jumped 12 points in 2 years.
Yeah.
I do think it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning. I think Trump has kind of forced us to recalibrate how we cover news, what we choose to cover. Story selection is incredibly important when it comes to trust in media. Like, there was a time when I lived in DC when, like, you'd watch TV, you'd read the blogs, you'd read the emails, and it was just like completely opaque stuff to a normal voter somewhere. They're like, I really don't care that so-and-so's chief of staff got fired today. That is so irrelevant to me. I would really like to know more about my mortgage, right?
Yeah.
Like, and so the more the media is covering these sort of like high stakes issues, I think trust in media has gone up.
Can I add a but to that, though? Because numbers don't lie, and we have the receipts now. Let me tell you what gets traffic, okay, on a lot of news websites. The royal family does really, really well on traffic, okay? That ain't your mortgage. That's not your health care. Voters want what they want, and people want what they want, and it doesn't lie. I'm not defending some sort of insider stuff that you're right, doesn't serve the voting public. The point that I'm making is that people in polls say a lot of things that they want you to hear that aren't always what the heart necessarily means.
So I think that, and I wrote about this too, Trump was successful at this. AOC is currently very successful at this. Smart politicians know how to make a policy a controversy, right? Barack Obama did this in 2007 when he said in a debate that we should talk to Iran and North Korea and Cuba.
With no preconditions.
Scandalous. Right. The media talked about it constantly. Yeah. That was a policy that most people were like, no, that makes sense. Yes. That makes sense to me. And build the wall was another one for a lot of Republican voters. So politicians probably need to be adept at figuring out how to puncture the press with policy, but that's one way to do it. I don't know.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Alexi McCammon with Axios, for those of you I haven't met. I'm curious to get your thoughts on whether and how you think that this election is maybe the most pure nominating contest we've seen, because it sort of seems like no one is necessarily preordained by the National Democratic Party or party leadership. And I guess secondarily, whether you think the Democratic Party and Democratic Party leaders have any sort of like control or power over who might ascend to be the so-called front runner.
Eliana, do you want to handle
Sure. I think that 2016 on the Republican side was a pretty pure nominating contest in that the RNC had virtually no control over who was nominated, and the proof of that is that had the RNC had any control, Trump absolutely would not have been the nominee. Reince Priebus would have worked and was, in fact, working furiously against that. On the Democratic side, I do think it's a pretty pure nominating contest, and it will be in part because I think the past president is sitting on the sidelines, more or less. He has not come out to back Joe Biden, and I think that it is analogous to what happened on the Republican side in 2016. It's worth noting that 2016 really remade the Republican Party and what it stands for. Jonathan wrote a recent piece about this, about that nobody would have said that the Republican Party stands for immigration restrictionism and protectionism in 2016. I think the protectionism thing is still very much up for debate. Yeah. But I think there are questions right now about what the Democratic Party stands for, and that will be debated in this upcoming primary. And it very much could be that after this contest goes through, we say the Democratic Party stands for something very different. I think it's an open question what the party stands for. Does it look more like Biden or like Bernie or like Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris or whatever the voice is that grabs the nomination? Now, if Trump wins, that question I think will be tabled. But if the Democratic nominee wins, this person has the chance to really remake the party in the way that Trump has done. Yeah. Granted, he is a force of personality, I think, unparalleled in modern history, perhaps. But I don't know, Jonathan.
But I think the Democratic Party is shaped by anti-Trumpism now more than anything else.
In the same way that the GOP was shaped by opposition to Obama, I think, in the previous 8 years.
Yeah, but I think this is more driven by a sense of kind of values rather than a policy set. I think the cohesive now is a kind of value set of we don't share those kind of grievances. And I think they're still figuring out the policy piece of it. But I think where's Alexi? I think it's definitely the most open Democratic primary since '04, maybe since '92, where there was just no obvious front runner, and the sort of party establishment, for what it is, was kind of divided over who the best answer is. How much sway, you asked, could party folks have? Not much, I don't think, early on. What I'm interested in is kind of later in the race, when there's been lots of states have voted, there's delegates being split. That's what I think is fascinating to me. At what point is there an attempt to weigh in and try to bring the race to an end? That's where it's going to be really interesting.
And Jamelle,
yeah, sort of on that point, I think it's important also to sort of look at kind of the structural issues. I think it's, primaries don't happen in a vacuum, and things like, right now, for example, there's an emerging norm among the Democratic candidates at taking money from big donors or super PACs to sort of verboten. You cannot do it. It compromises your positions. And so that structurally changes how much money candidates can raise, what are the sources of that money, and it changes sort of the nature of how we evaluate candidates in that context. I think looking at things like that, even looking at voting orders, sort of when are candidates actually being to vote, how does this influence this building strategy, doing fundraising, all these things, is really critical for trying to figure out with how the primary is going to go, and where relative party influence is going to make itself felt.
Good. Here we go.
I have a question about the diner story. Every time I read one of those, there's this.
You get hungry.
Yes, I get hungry.
You get hungry.
There's this hugely obvious distance between the author and the nine Trump voters or whatever have you is quoted in the story, and I mean there's like this voyeuristic thing about it. I just get this feeling like this author has never hung out at this diner or any similar diner. Right? Is there a better way to do that story?
I mean, there must be, right?
I kind of think the way to do that story is to not just do, blue-collar white people at diners, but to do all kinds of people at diners. When I was covering the Doug Jones Whereas in Alabama, I spent a lot of time in meet and threes just talking to blue-collar black people, and that was an instructive experience, and it helped me better understand what was happening in the state. And I think extending that kind of anthropological courtesy to lots of different kinds of people is the way to do those stories.
But also, like, last cycle, I went to Hamilton County, Ohio, and just hung out in a parking lot of a shopping center that had a Whole Foods, a Bed Bath & Beyond, and, like, a Chico's or whatever. Like, suburbia was the battleground of the last campaign, and quite frankly, most campaigns.
Yes.
And, like, that's not exotic, and it's probably normal to a lot of reporters who might have grown up in the suburbs, but, like, you get a lot of texture from just talking to regular people everywhere. I will say about the diner thing, which is really funny, like, the diner trope has existed in media. It certainly accelerated post-Trump. That thing, especially in TV news, has been around forever. Like, it's so funny. Like, going back previous cycles, like, there'd always be, like, some anchor who would come into town and be like, "Where's a diner?" And he'd post up at a diner and, like, talk to voters over, like a chili dog.
Omelet, yeah.
Like, that's just been around forever because I think coastal reporters are kind of enamored by rural America. They want to go to a diner. Like,
It's exotic.
But they probably should just go to, like, the Panera Bread in, like, Dallas County
Something a
outside
little
of
bit
Des
Well,
Moines.
I was going to say, I kind of get frustrated about the diner critique, which I think certainly is overdone. There's no question about it. But hell, I spent the last 2 years mostly like around Lululemons and like in suburbs because that's where the midterms were fought, right? It was like at Pete's Coffee, Lululemons. Yeah, I got some good gear, man. It's really got me working out again. It's great. But look, the midterms were not played out in diners in Rustburg. They were played out in like Buckhead and like similar type demographics. And Democrats won 40 seats in the House because they won those kinds of voters. And so it's not all fair to say that we're hanging out in diners. And I think Jamelle is right. The answer is not less diners. It's go everywhere. It's go to cities, go to suburbs, rural areas, and don't limit yourself to one demographic. Talk to everybody, and you'll get a bigger sort of sense for the country is. Sorry.
Great, thank you.
Hi there. Just wanted to talk about the theme of diversity in 2020. Relating to your question about covering women, but also there's the way that you would cover Kamala Harris might be different because, being a black woman or a young gay mayor, and also considering the eligible voters, minorities making up a third of the voting bloc in 2020. Do you have any tips on reporting on the nuances and the intersectionality of, policy and just how we're covering the candidates?
I was an embed in 2007 for CNN, and I was assigned to South Carolina, which there was an open race on both sides. A lot of Republican voters. At the time, the religious right was probably more powerful in Republican politics, and on the left, that was a majority black primary electorate. Like white dude moving to South Carolina. Like my family's from the South. I feel like I sort of spoke the language, but like going into the black barbershops as a white guy and going into the black churches as a white guy, like I think it actually made me a better reporter because it wasn't easy. Like I think that we should send people. I mean, this is a totally weird analogy, but the New York Times does a good job of this, like with reporters on beats. Like I knew a political reporter at the New York Times in 2008 who then went to like the book review. Like if you reset yourself in different spaces, like that makes you a better reporter because it makes you question all of your assumptions. It makes you like think about the questions you ask people. So I think that like editors should be mindful of assigning people to candidates and to places where they're going to make the reporters feel uncomfortable, right? And like
You're saying that's a good thing.
That's a good thing. I think a white guy like can go into a black church and like be a good reporter. Now, that doesn't mean I understand everything in every historical context and permutation, but I do think that it's a valuable thing to make reporters feel uncomfortable.
We tell other people's stories. That's what we do. And you can't do that if you don't understand other people's stories.
Okay, good.
Good morning. So I was thinking, I want to hear your thoughts about the amount of coverage that third parties receive. I was thinking along the lines, are we more concerned with potential winners rather than new ideas, or the abilities of these parties to potentially sway elections, not just numbers-wise, but in terms of like ideology? Like we have a lot of Democratic socialists who have like overlap with the Green Party, or libertarians with the Republican Party. So third-party coverage.
I think that's a great question. And I think this is going to matter a little bit more on the Dem side than on the Trump side, in that Trump has been able to sort of pull the party in his direction. But on the Dem side, I do think that we're seeing more junior members of the party being able to lead the pack of nominees in places they might not have thought they'd go. The Green New Deal was obviously a great example of this, and doing it through the power of personality and social media. So we've seen, I think, pretty good coverage of AOC and Ilhan Omar's power through policy and social media to be pretty important forces in the Democratic primary in terms of setting the policy agenda, and I think that they will continue to do so and to do that.
And I think one of the best reporters out there covering politics is Dave Weigel from the Washington Post, and one of the reasons he's so good is because he's spent years covering like offbeat political movements. Like he was really early to the Tea Party, he was early to the DSA stuff. Like he's just libertarianism. Like he's sort of interested in kind of like weird grassroots movements, and to his benefit as a journalist, those things then bubbled up into the mainstream. And not only was he conversant in their politics, like he had the best sources because he like actually took a couple days to like go hang out with the weirdos in like Council Bluffs, and like 5 years later they're really important people, and he's broken some really great stories around it. Like he's one of the best because of that.
Great. So we are out of time. Thank you so much to the audience for great questions.
Organizer's privilege. I just wanted, before we let this amazing group go, I was thinking about Eliana's comment at the beginning about sneering disdain, and I think it's undeniable that in this last war, what we think of as opinion has crept into our journalism, and maybe that's the effect of Twitter, maybe it's other things too. I just wanted to take advantage of having Jamelle with us to ask who's made that transition from reporting to writing opinion. I'm wondering how you think about those two disciplines. Do you think about them as distinct?
So I was told even with the organizer, when someone doesn't speak into the mic, I'm to restate the question. So let's see. Given that we've described coverage of Trump as having sneering disdain, I think was the phrase, and we've seen more opinion creep into news stories, would you, Jamelle, talk a little bit about the two disciplines and how they relate to each other?
Right. I mean, this gets to what we mean about opinion. If we mean opinion simply sort of stating outright a view, not necessarily supported or backed by any deep research or any considered discussion or thinking, then I don't think that actually has very much place in either, certainly not traditional news journalism, but not really opinion journalism either. I don't think punditry, let me put that, I don't think punditry is particularly useful, regardless of where it comes from. I think what's useful is, for someone like me, recognizing that I have a perspective, I have a set of political commitments, and those drive my understanding of the world. And based off of that understanding, or sort of reflecting on the understanding, really diving into questions and issues and events with an eye towards understanding and utilizing the tools of traditional reporting, interviews, deep research. For me, that often means like deep historical inquiry, and bringing that to bear on these sort of questions of coverage in politics. I think that's useful, and I think there's ways in which ordinary reporters can do some of that as well. Sort of utilizing historical sources in particular as ways to give value to news consumers. I often think that 2016 would have gone much better just if people had in their heads someone like George Wallace when kind of covering him on the trail, had in their heads kind of previous similar figures in American history, and for readers helping to make ties between those things instead of presenting him as sui generis.
Great answer. Again, thank you for the great questions, and thank you to this terrific panel. And now we will, thank you, Eliana.